In the vast expanse of the ancient world, where distances stretched beyond the imagination of most travelers, where mountains rose like walls and seas separated continents, where deserts extended to horizons that seemed to mark the edge of existence itself, the Roman Empire stood as a marvel of organization and control. At the height of its power, during the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, this extraordinary dominion reached from the windswept moorlands of Britannia in the far northwest to the sun-baked frontiers of Mesopotamia in the distant east. From the dense forests of Germania to the golden sands of North Africa, from the Atlantic shores of Hispania to the ancient cities of Syria, Rome commanded territories that encompassed 3 continents and dozens of cultures, languages, and traditions. Within this immense realm, cities rose from the earth like stone flowers, connected by ribbons of paved road that stretched across valleys and mountains, bridging rivers and traversing wilderness. In these cities, merchants traded goods from across the known world. Silk from distant lands in the east passed through markets alongside olive oil from Hispania, grain from Egypt mingled with wine from Gaul, while craftsmen fashioned goods from materials that had traveled thousands of miles to reach their workshops. Soldiers stood guard on distant frontiers, watching for threats that might emerge from beyond the boundaries of Roman control. Governors administered vast provinces, making decisions that affected the lives of millions. And in Rome itself, the center of this extraordinary web, emperors sat upon thrones from which they attempted to guide the destinies of lands they might never see with their own eyes. The challenge of governing such an empire was profound. How could an emperor in Rome know what transpired in distant Britannia? How could a general on the Rhine frontier receive orders from the capital before circumstances changed beyond recognition? How could tax collectors in Egypt ensure their revenues reached the imperial treasury? How could a governor in Syria communicate urgent intelligence about threats from Parthia? How could merchants in Gaul learn of market conditions in Africa? The answer to these questions, the solution to this fundamental problem of distance and time, lay in one of Rome's most remarkable achievements, a system that bound the empire together with invisible threads of communication and movement. This was the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, a vast and intricate network that moved messages, officials, and essential goods across the Roman world with a speed and reliability that would not be matched in Europe for more than 1,000 years after Rome's fall. It was not merely a system for carrying letters, though it did that. It was not simply a means of transport, though it provided that as well. The cursus publicus was the central nervous system of the Roman state, the mechanism through which the empire's brain in Rome could sense what occurred in its most distant limbs and could send commands that would be executed at the furthest reaches of Roman power. Understanding how this system worked requires us to step back in time, to imagine a world before telegraphs and telephones, before railways and automobiles, before any of the technologies that we now take for granted when we think about communication and travel. In the ancient world, information moved at the speed of a human being, whether walking, riding, or sailing. A message could travel no faster than the messenger who carried it, and the messenger could move no faster than the animal that bore them or the ship that sailed them across the waters. Yet within these constraints, the Romans built something extraordinary. They created a system that could move a message from one end of the empire to another in a matter of weeks, sometimes days. They established a network of roads, stations, animals, and personnel that functioned with remarkable consistency across thousands of miles and hundreds of years. They developed protocols and procedures, documents and authorizations that regulated who could use the system and how. They solved logistical problems that would challenge even modern administrators, coordinating the supply of horses and mules, the maintenance of roads and buildings, the provisioning of food and fodder across an area that encompassed much of the known world. The story of the cursus publicus is a story of engineering and organization, of administration and logistics, of power and control. It is a story that reveals how the Romans thought about governance and communication, about the relationship between the center and the periphery, between the ruler and the ruled. It is a story that shows us both the brilliance of Roman administrative thinking and the burdens that such systems placed upon the people who sustained them. It is a story that begins not in Rome, but in another great empire that preceded it, in the lands of ancient Persia, where the first truly organized postal system took shape along a road that connected the heart of a kingdom to its distant provinces. The Persian legacy and the Roman Republic. Long before Augustus established the cursus publicus, long before Rome itself had grown from a small city-state into a Mediterranean power, another great empire had solved the problem of communication across vast distances. In the lands that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, the Persian Empire under the Achaemenid dynasty had created a system of roads and relay stations that allowed messages to travel with unprecedented speed. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, described this Persian system with obvious admiration. He told of the Royal Road, a paved highway that ran from the Persian capital at Susa to the city of Sardis in Asia Minor, a distance of more than 1,500 miles. Along this road, at regular intervals, the Persian kings had established stations where fresh horses waited and where messengers could rest before continuing their journeys. The system operated on the principle of the relay. A messenger would ride from one station to the next, covering perhaps 20 or 30 miles in a day's hard riding. At each station, he would transfer his messages to a fresh messenger mounted on a fresh horse, and that messenger would ride to the next station, and so on, creating a chain of riders that could move information across the empire far faster than any single traveler could manage. Herodotus wrote of this system with words that would later become famous, inscribed on postal buildings in later centuries. He described how neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness prevented these couriers from completing their appointed rounds. The Persian messenger system represented a triumph of organization over distance, a demonstration that a centrally controlled empire could maintain awareness of and influence over territories separated by weeks of ordinary travel. This Persian innovation did not go unnoticed by the Romans. As Rome expanded its power eastward, as Roman generals encountered Persian and later Parthian armies, as Roman merchants traded with the cities of the east, knowledge of this postal system spread. Roman administrators saw the utility of such an arrangement. They understood that controlling an empire required more than military might. It required information, coordination, and rapid response to crises. Yet during the Roman Republic, no such centralized system existed. The Roman state of the Republican period relied instead on a patchwork of ad hoc arrangements for sending messages and moving officials. When the Senate needed to communicate with a general in the field or with a provincial governor, they used various means. Sometimes they employed state-owned slaves called tabellarii who carried official dispatches. Sometimes they contracted with private courier services. Often they relied on the personal household slaves of the officials themselves, men who would carry letters and messages as part of their service to their masters. This system, informal and decentralized as it was, functioned adequately when Rome controlled only Italy and the immediately surrounding regions. Communication between Rome and its nearby territories could be accomplished in days or at most a few weeks. But as Rome expanded, as it conquered Carthage and took control of North Africa, as it absorbed the Greek East and pushed into Gaul and Hispania, the limitations of this ad hoc approach became increasingly apparent. Provincial governors who served for limited terms and who needed to maintain regular communication with Rome to manage their provinces effectively developed their own courier networks. Wealthy Romans established private systems of messengers. The publicani, the tax collectors who bid on contracts to collect provincial revenues, maintained their own courier services to facilitate their business operations. Military commanders like Julius Caesar employed soldiers as messengers to carry dispatches between their armies and Rome. These private and semi-official arrangements worked, but they were inefficient and unequal. A wealthy senator with extensive resources could maintain rapid communication across the empire. A less wealthy official might find himself isolated, dependent on irregular and unreliable means of sending and receiving information. The system favored those with money and power, and it placed significant burdens on the communities through which these private couriers traveled, as they requisitioned horses, demanded food and shelter, and disrupted local life without any centralized oversight or compensation. The civil wars that marked the end of the Roman Republic demonstrated both the utility and the limitations of these informal courier networks. During his campaigns in Gaul, Julius Caesar maintained regular communication with Rome through a system of military couriers who carried his dispatches back to the capital. These messages, carefully crafted to influence public opinion and maintain Caesar's political position, traveled along the roads of Gaul and Italy with as much speed as the available means would allow. Yet the system was Caesar's personal creation, maintained at his own expense or at the expense of the territories he controlled. When Augustus emerged victorious from the final civil war and established himself as the first emperor of Rome, he inherited a state with immense territorial extent, but no systematic means of communication and control. The informal networks of the Republican period were inadequate for the needs of a centralized imperial government. Augustus needed a system that would allow him to know what occurred in every corner of the empire, that would enable him to move officials and troops rapidly in response to crises, that would facilitate the collection of taxes and the enforcement of imperial decrees. The solution Augustus chose drew heavily on the Persian model, but it was adapted to the specific needs and circumstances of the Roman state. Around the year 20 before the Common Era, Augustus established what would become known as the cursus publicus, the public way, or the imperial post. This was not simply a copying of the Persian system. The Romans made significant modifications, created new administrative structures, and integrated the postal system with their unparalleled network of roads in ways that would make it uniquely effective and uniquely Roman. Augustus approached the creation of the cursus publicus with the same systematic thinking he applied to other aspects of imperial administration. He understood that effective governance required information, and information required reliable communication. The civil wars that had ravaged Rome for decades had demonstrated the chaos that could result when different factions controlled different communication networks, when messages could be intercepted or delayed for political advantage, when no one could be certain that their dispatches would reach their intended recipients. By creating a state-controlled postal system, Augustus achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. He gave himself and his successors the ability to monitor and control the vast territories of the empire from Rome. He created a mechanism for rapid military response to threats or rebellions. He established a symbol of imperial power and reach that demonstrated Rome's ability to overcome the barriers of distance and terrain. And he created a system that, by its very centralization, reinforced the new political order he was establishing, an order centered on the emperor rather than on the Senate or on competing military commanders. The Roman biographer Suetonius, writing more than a century after Augustus, described the emperor's motivation and method. Augustus wanted to receive reports of events from across the empire as quickly and easily as possible. Initially, he followed the Persian method, establishing stations along the roads where young men would wait to carry messages to the next station in relay fashion. But Augustus soon realized that this system, while fast, had significant limitations. When a message arrived at Rome after passing through multiple hands, there was no one who could provide additional context or answer questions about the situation that had prompted the message. The chain of relay runners meant that information could travel quickly, but understanding could not. So Augustus modified the system. Instead of relay runners, he established a network where a single courier would travel the entire distance, carrying the message from its origin to its destination. This courier could then be questioned about circumstances, could provide oral elaboration on written dispatches, could clarify ambiguities, and offer observations. The trade-off was speed for comprehension. A relay system could move a message faster, but a single courier system provided richer information and greater security. The message remained in the hands of a single, known, and presumably loyal individual throughout its journey. This modification reflected a characteristically Roman approach to governance. The Romans were practical people who valued results over theoretical purity. If the Persian relay system was faster but provided less useful information, then the system would be adapted to better serve actual needs. The slight loss in raw speed was more than compensated for by the gain in security and in the quality of intelligence that reached the imperial court. The decision also reflected the realities of Roman administration. The empire was not merely a collection of territories to be monitored from afar. It was a complex organism requiring nuanced understanding of local conditions, cultural differences, political dynamics, and economic realities. A relay system that simply transmitted written words missed much of this complexity. A courier who had actually witnessed events, who had spoken with local officials, who understood the context behind a report, could provide the kind of detailed, sophisticated intelligence that effective governance required. To make this system workable, Augustus needed infrastructure. He needed roads that would allow rapid travel. He needed stations where couriers could rest, eat, and obtain fresh horses. He needed administrative structures to manage the system, to issue authorizations for its use, to maintain the physical facilities, and to ensure that it served the needs of the state, rather than becoming a resource exploited by the powerful for their personal benefit. Over the decades following its initial establishment, the cursus publicus evolved into precisely such a system, growing more formalized, more regulated, and more extensive with each passing generation. The foundation of stone, Roman roads, and engineering. Before examining the cursus publicus itself, we must understand the physical foundation upon which it rested, the extraordinary network of roads that the Romans built across their empire. These roads were among the most remarkable engineering achievements of the ancient world, and they made the postal system possible. Roman road building began during the Republic, driven initially by military necessity. When Roman armies marched to war, they needed routes that would allow them to move quickly, that would support the passage of heavy wagons carrying supplies, that would remain passable in all seasons and in all weather. The first great Roman road, the Via Appia, began construction in 312 before the Common Era under the direction of the censor Appius Claudius Caecus. This road, which came to be called the Queen of Roads, stretched initially from Rome to Capua, a distance of more than 130 miles, and was later extended to reach the port of Brundisium on the Adriatic coast. The Via Appia demonstrated the principles that would guide Roman road construction for centuries to come. Roman engineers favored directness over ease of construction. They built roads in as straight a line as possible between their endpoints, even when this meant enormous labor to overcome natural obstacles. Where rivers blocked the path, they built bridges. Where mountains rose in the way, they cut through rock or tunneled beneath it. Where valleys needed to be crossed, they constructed viaducts. Where marshes spread across the landscape, they drained them or built causeways above the wet ground. This commitment to straight, direct routes served multiple purposes. Straight roads minimized travel distance, allowing armies and messengers to reach their destinations as quickly as possible. The engineering challenges that straight roads created also demonstrated Roman power and capability, showing subject peoples and potential enemies alike that Rome could reshape the landscape itself to suit its purposes. The roads became not just practical infrastructure, but symbols of Roman dominion, physical manifestations of the empire's ability to impose order on the natural world. The construction of a major Roman road was an enormous undertaking that required careful planning and tremendous labor. Roman surveyors, called grammatici after the surveying instrument they used, would first mark out the route, using tools like the groma to ensure straight lines and the chorobates to measure levels and gradients. They established the path that the road would follow, placing markers at intervals to guide the construction crews. Once the route was determined, the actual construction could begin. The process started with excavation. Workers would dig a trench along the path of the future road, often reaching down 6 to 9 feet until they hit bedrock or firm, stable ground. This trench, called the fossa, would form the foundation of the road. The excavated earth was not wasted, but was instead used to raise the level of the ground on either side of the road, creating an elevated roadway that would help with drainage. With the foundation trench prepared, construction proceeded in layers, each carefully designed to contribute to the road's strength and durability. The first layer, called the statumen, consisted of large stones, often fist-sized or larger, packed tightly together to create a solid base. This layer typically measured 10 to 24 inches in thickness, providing a strong foundation that would distribute the weight of traffic over the underlying ground. Above the statumen came the rudus, a layer of smaller stones mixed with lime mortar. This layer served to bind the larger foundation stones together and to create a more level surface for the layers above. The rudus was carefully compacted, often by being rolled with heavy stone rollers pulled by teams of oxen, to eliminate air pockets and to ensure maximum stability. The third layer, called the nucleus, consisted of even finer materials, often gravel mixed with hot lime. This layer was meticulously leveled, creating a smooth surface that would support the road's final wearing surface. The nucleus, like the rudus below it, was thoroughly compacted to prevent settling and to create a solid platform. Finally came the summum dorsum, the surface layer that travelers would actually traverse. On the most important roads, this surface consisted of large, carefully fitted paving stones, often made from hard volcanic rock, limestone, or basalt, depending on what materials were available locally. These stones were cut to fit tightly together, creating a surface that was remarkably smooth and durable. On less important roads, the surface might simply be gravel, packed hard and occasionally replenished as it wore away. The engineering did not end with the layered construction. Roman road builders understood that water was the enemy of roads, that standing water would seep into the layers, freeze in winter, and break apart even the strongest construction. To prevent this, they built roads with a slight convex curve, higher in the center than at the edges. This camber, as it is called, caused rainwater to run off to the sides rather than pooling on the surface. Along the edges of the road, workers dug drainage ditches that would carry water away from the roadbed, preventing it from saturating the ground beneath. The roads were also built with curbs, raised edges of stone that marked the boundaries of the paved surface and helped to hold the road together. These curbs served a practical purpose, but they also had symbolic significance. They marked the road as a distinct space, a zone of imperial authority and control that was separate from the surrounding landscape. At regular intervals along major roads, the Romans placed milestones, cylindrical columns of stone that marked the distance in Roman miles from Rome itself or from major provincial centers. A Roman mile, slightly shorter than a modern mile at roughly 1,480 meters, represented 1,000 paces, where a pace was counted as 2 steps. These milestones served multiple purposes. They allowed travelers to gauge their progress and plan their journeys. They proclaimed which emperor had built or repaired the road, making them instruments of imperial propaganda. And they provided reference points for the administration of the postal system, as stations were often described in terms of their distance in miles from major cities. The scope of the Roman road network was extraordinary. By the height of the empire in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, Roman roads stretched across more than 400,000 kilometers, with over 80,000 kilometers of stone-paved highway. These roads connected every significant city in the empire to Rome and to each other. They reached from Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britannia to the cataracts of the Nile in Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. The construction of these roads transformed landscapes. In some regions, the engineering required to build a straight road through difficult terrain was staggering. In the Iron Gates region along the Danube, Roman engineers carved a road partially into the rock face of cliffs, creating a passage where none had existed before. The Tabula Traiana, a memorial plaque still visible today, commemorates this achievement. Part of the road was cut directly into the mountainside, while other sections projected out over the river on wooden structures supported by beams fitted into holes drilled into the rock. Mountain passes presented particular challenges. Roads like the Via Domitiana, which connected Rome to Puteoli and Naples, had to traverse the Apennine Mountains. Engineers selected the most practical passes, but even these required extensive work. Switchbacks allowed roads to climb steep slopes gradually. Retaining walls prevented landslides from burying the roadway. Drainage systems channeled water away from the surface to prevent erosion during heavy rains. In marshy or wetland areas, different techniques were required. Sometimes the marsh would be drained through an extensive system of ditches and canals that lowered the water table enough to allow stable construction. In other cases, particularly when drainage was impractical, engineers built causeways, elevated roads that crossed the wetland on foundations of piled timber or stone. These causeways might stretch for miles across fens and marshes, creating passages through regions that would otherwise have been impassable for much of the year. River crossings demanded bridges, and Roman bridge building was itself an engineering marvel. Some Roman bridges were simple affairs, wooden structures on stone piers that could be constructed relatively quickly. Others were magnificent stone arches that still stand today, 2,000 years after their construction. The Pont du Gard in southern Gaul, built to carry an aqueduct across the Garden River, demonstrates the Roman mastery of the arch. Though built for water rather than road traffic, it employed the same principles used in road bridges throughout the empire. Stone arch bridges required careful engineering. The weight of the bridge and the traffic it carried had to be transferred through the arch to the piers and abutments that supported it. Roman engineers understood these principles well, creating bridges that distributed loads efficiently and that could withstand not just the weight of traffic, but also the forces exerted by flowing water and seasonal floods. Many Roman bridges incorporated multiple arches, allowing them to span wide rivers while maintaining structural integrity. The construction of a major bridge was a significant undertaking that might take years to complete. Workers had to divert the river or work in cofferdams, temporary enclosures that kept water away from construction sites. They had to excavate down to bedrock or to stable soil to create foundations for piers. They had to quarry, transport, and precisely fit enormous quantities of stone. The cost was substantial, but the result was infrastructure that could last for centuries with minimal maintenance. The roads themselves required different levels of investment depending on their importance and expected use. The great highways that connected major cities and carried heavy military and commercial traffic received the full treatment. Deep foundations, multiple carefully compacted layers, precisely fitted paving stones, drainage systems, and milestones. These roads were built to last and to handle intensive use. Lesser roads, serving smaller communities or less critical routes, might receive simpler treatment. They might have shallower foundations, simpler surfaces, less elaborate drainage. But even these secondary roads were built according to principles that made them far superior to the unpaved tracks and trails that had existed before Roman engineering transformed the landscape. Different roads served different purposes and consequently were built to different standards. The via publicae, the public or main roads, were the great highways that connected the most important cities of the empire. These roads received the full measure of Roman engineering, with deep foundations, multiple layers, and carefully fitted stone surfaces. They were maintained at state expense and were intended to last for generations. The viae militares were military roads, built and maintained specifically for army use, often during campaigns of conquest. These roads might be built to the same high standards as the public roads, but their primary purpose was military movement rather than general travel. There were also viae privatae, private roads built and maintained by landowners for their own use. These were typically simpler affairs, often just gravel or dirt tracks that connected estates to the main roads. And there were viae vicinales, secondary roads that linked villages to the main highways or to each other. These local roads formed the capillaries of the road system, allowing goods and people to move between the major arteries of communication and the countless small communities that dotted the landscape. The construction and maintenance of this road network required enormous resources and continuous effort. Labor came from various sources. Roman soldiers, when not actively campaigning, were often employed in road construction, an activity that kept them fit, taught them engineering skills, and produced infrastructure that would benefit the army in future campaigns. Enslaved people provided much of the heavy labor, quarrying stone, moving earth, and performing the countless tasks required to build a road through difficult terrain. Local communities were often required to provide labor for roads that passed through their territories, a burden that was sometimes resented but was generally accepted as a necessary part of life under Roman rule. The financial costs of road construction were substantial. Initial construction of a major road could absorb enormous amounts of money, and ongoing maintenance required continuous investment. During the Republic, censors were expected to fund road repairs from their own wealth, an expectation that made the office both prestigious and expensive. Under the Empire, the state assumed responsibility for the major roads, funding their construction and maintenance through taxation and through the allocation of imperial resources. This vast network of roads made the cursus publicus possible. Without these engineered highways, rapid communication across the empire would have been impossible. The roads provided the physical substrate, the actual paths along which messages and messengers could travel. But roads alone were not sufficient. The cursus publicus also required stations, facilities where couriers could rest, eat, exchange horses, and spend the night when necessary. These stations, carefully placed at regular intervals along the roads, formed the operational heart of the postal system. Mansiones, the lodging stations. The mansiones, the larger stations that provided overnight accommodation, were complex facilities that reveal much about how the cursus publicus functioned in practice. The word mansio comes from the Latin verb manere, meaning to remain or to stay, and these stations were precisely that, places where travelers on imperial business could remain for the night before continuing their journeys. The spacing of mansiones along Roman roads was determined by the practical realities of ancient travel. In an era before mechanical transport, the speed at which people and goods could move was limited by the endurance of animals and the stamina of travelers. Ox-drawn carts, the heavy vehicles used to transport goods and equipment, could manage roughly 30 kilometers in a day under good conditions. Horseback riders could cover somewhat greater distances, perhaps 40 to 50 kilometers, when traveling at a moderate pace that would not exhaust their mounts. This meant that mansiones needed to be placed at intervals that matched these travel capabilities. In practice, mansiones were typically situated about 25 to 30 kilometers apart along major routes, though this distance could vary based on terrain and the strategic importance of particular routes. In mountainous regions where travel was slower, mansiones might be closer together. In flat, easily traversed areas, they might be spaced somewhat further apart. The goal was to ensure that travelers on official business could reach a mansio by nightfall, could rest comfortably, and could resume their journeys the following morning without undue hardship. The physical structure of a mansio varied considerably depending on when it was built, where it was located, and how much traffic it served. In newly conquered territories, early mansiones might be little more than fortified enclosures, castra, that had originally served as military camps and were then adapted for postal use. As provinces became more settled and traffic increased, these primitive facilities evolved into more substantial structures. A typical mansio in a well-established province would include several distinct areas, each serving a specific function. There were stables where horses and mules were kept, with space for feeding and tending to the animals that provided transportation. These stables needed to accommodate not just the animals currently in use, but also fresh mounts that would be available for travelers who needed to exchange exhausted horses for rested ones. The number of animals kept at a mansio depended on the traffic it served, but inscriptions and administrative documents suggest that larger mansions might stable 40 or more animals, providing the capacity to serve multiple parties of travelers simultaneously. Beyond the stables were storage areas for fodder, grain, and hay that would feed these animals. Keeping dozens of horses and mules required substantial amounts of feed, and mansiones needed to maintain sufficient supplies to ensure that animals would always be available. The procurement and storage of this fodder represented a significant logistical challenge. Local communities were often required to provide the necessary supplies, either as a tax obligation or as goods purchased by the state. For human travelers, mansiones provided sleeping quarters typically divided to accommodate different ranks of travelers. High-ranking officials, provincial governors, or important messengers carrying urgent imperial dispatches might be given private rooms or at least partition spaces that offered some degree of comfort and privacy. Lower-ranking couriers and officials might sleep in common dormitories, simple rooms with basic bedding where multiple travelers would rest together. Archaeological evidence from excavated mansiones reveals fascinating details about these facilities. At the site of ancient Dion in Macedonia, excavations uncovered a mansio along with an inscription that detailed its equipment and capacity. This particular facility could accommodate at least 25 people overnight, with provisions for both ordinary travelers and select clientele who received better accommodations. The building included dining facilities where travelers could obtain meals, kitchens where food was prepared, and common areas where people could wait or rest. Documents from Egypt provide additional information about the scale of mansiones in busy locations. Some Egyptian stations served as many as 90 travelers in a single day, an indication of the heavy traffic that moved along major routes. These large facilities required significant staffs to operate. There would be stable hands to care for the horses, cooks to prepare food, servants to clean and maintain the buildings, and administrators to manage the operations and keep records of who used the facility and what resources they consumed. The person in charge of a mansio was called a mansionarius, a station master who bore responsibility for ensuring that the facility functioned properly. The mansionarius had to coordinate the supply of provisions, maintain the buildings and equipment, manage the staff, and deal with the travelers who passed through. This was a position of some responsibility and presumably offered opportunities for both legitimate income and corrupt profit, as the mansionarius controlled valuable resources that might be diverted for personal gain. The atmosphere at a mansio would have been businesslike and functional rather than comfortable or luxurious. These were not inns designed for leisure travelers or wealthy tourists. They were government facilities serving official purposes, and while they provided necessary amenities, comfort was secondary to efficiency. The food served would have been simple but adequate. The beds would have been basic, perhaps straw mattresses or simple cots. The accommodations were sufficient for rest, but not for relaxation. Yet for all their simplicity, mansiones were vital nodes in the imperial communication network. They provided the safe, predictable stopping points that made long-distance travel feasible for couriers and officials. They ensured that messages could continue moving even as night fell, because carriers knew that accommodation awaited them at regular intervals. They served as collection points for information, as arriving travelers might exchange news with departing ones, creating an informal network of intelligence that supplemented the official dispatches. Mansiones also served administrative functions beyond simply providing rest and food. Some had scribes on staff who could copy documents, draft letters, or record official transactions. They might have small treasuries where funds being transported could be secured overnight. They served as waypoints where traveling officials could pause to conduct business, meet with local notables, or handle administrative matters before continuing their journeys. The construction and operation of mansions represented a significant expense, one that fell primarily on local communities rather than on the central government. Although the empire bore some costs, particularly for major facilities on critical routes, much of the burden of building and maintaining these stations was devolved to provincial cities and towns. This was accomplished through a system of obligations and requisitions that required communities along postal routes to provide the resources necessary for the cursus publicus to function. This burden was not always welcomed. Communities might resent having to construct and maintain facilities that served primarily the needs of distant imperial authorities rather than local populations. The costs could be substantial, including not just the initial construction but ongoing expenses for repairs, supplies, and staffing. Local elites, who typically bore much of this financial burden, sometimes complained about the impositions placed upon them. Yet resistance was limited. The cursus publicus was an imperial institution, backed by the authority of the emperor. Failure to maintain a mansio properly or to provide the required resources could bring unwelcome attention from provincial governors or even from the emperor himself. Most communities complied, accepting the costs as one of many burdens that came with being part of the empire, alongside taxation, military recruitment, and other impositions. Archaeological investigations have revealed the physical remains of mansiones at sites throughout the former Roman Empire. In Hispania, excavations along the Via Augusta have uncovered station buildings with characteristic layouts, central courtyards surrounded by rooms, stable areas, and storage facilities. In North Africa, particularly along routes in modern Tunisia and Libya, the traces of desert stations can still be discerned, often fortified structures that provided safety as well as rest in regions where banditry was a concern. In Britannia, along roads like Watling Street and the Fosse Way, the foundations of Roman-era way stations have been identified, sometimes beneath modern villages that grew up around these ancient stopping points. Each of these sites tells a story of connectivity, of the Roman determination to bind their vast empire together through reliable communication. The mansiones were more than buildings. They were symbols of imperial reach, physical manifestations of Rome's ability to project power and maintain control across distances that would have overwhelmed less organized states. Mutationes, the relay stations. Between the mansiones, at more frequent intervals, stood the mutationes, smaller facilities dedicated primarily to the exchange of horses and brief rest rather than overnight accommodation. The word mutatio comes from the Latin mutare, to change, and these stations were named for their primary function, changing exhausted horses for fresh ones. Mutationes were typically spaced every 8 to 12 Roman miles along major roads, which translates to roughly 12 to 18 kilometers in modern measurement. This spacing was calculated to match the distance a horse could travel at a good pace before needing to rest. By placing stations at these intervals, the cursus publicus ensured that couriers and officials could maintain steady progress without exhausting their mounts. The physical structure of a mutatio was simpler and smaller than that of a mansio. At its most basic, a mutatio consisted of stables where fresh horses were kept waiting, a small shelter where travelers could briefly rest and perhaps obtain refreshment, and facilities for the care of horses, including areas where tired animals could be fed and tended to before being used again. There might be a blacksmith's forge for shoeing horses or making emergency repairs to equipment. There would certainly be storage for fodder and water for the animals. The staff at a mutatio was correspondingly smaller than at a mansio. There would be stable hands whose primary responsibility was caring for the horses and facilitating quick exchanges when travelers arrived needing fresh mounts. There might be a veterinarian, a mulomedicus, who could treat animals that had become lame or sick. There might be a wheelwright, a carpentarius, who could repair damaged vehicles. And there would be a supervisor, similar to the mansionarius of the larger stations, who managed operations and kept records. The process of exchanging horses at a mutatio was designed for efficiency. When a courier or official traveling on imperial business arrived at the station, they would present their diploma, the travel warrant that authorized use of the cursus publicus. The station staff would verify this authorization and then provide fresh horses to replace the exhausted animals. The tired horses would be unsaddled, fed, watered, and allowed to rest before being used again for subsequent travelers. This exchange could happen remarkably quickly when the system was functioning properly. A courier in a great hurry might spend only minutes at a mutatio, just long enough to transfer his belongings and dispatches to a fresh horse and to perhaps grab a drink of water or a piece of bread before continuing. This rapid turnover was essential for urgent messages that needed to travel as quickly as possible. The number of horses kept at a mutatio varied based on the amount of traffic the station served. Historical sources suggest that major stations might keep 20 to 40 horses ready at any given time, ensuring that even if multiple parties of travelers arrived simultaneously, all could be provided with fresh mounts without delay. Less busy stations might maintain smaller numbers. The logistics of maintaining this horse supply were complex. Horses needed to be fed, watered, and cared for continuously. They required shoes which wore out and needed regular replacement. They fell sick or were injured and needed to be replaced. All of this required a continuous flow of resources from the surrounding communities. Like the mansiones, the mutationes were supported primarily through local contributions. Communities along postal routes were obligated to provide the horses, the fodder, the personnel, and the facilities necessary for these stations to operate. This burden was distributed across property owners in proportion to their wealth or land holdings, creating a system where the costs of imperial communication fell on provincial populations rather than on the central treasury. The strain this placed on communities should not be underestimated. A typical mutatio with 30 horses would require enormous amounts of feed, perhaps several tons of grain and hay per month. Providing this feed year-round, ensuring its quality and availability, even during poor harvests or difficult seasons, represented a significant economic burden. The horses themselves represented substantial capital investment. A good horse was valuable, and losing horses to disease or overwork meant having to purchase replacements. Archaeological evidence of mutationes is more limited than for mansiones, partly because these smaller stations were often less substantial structures that have left fewer traces. However, excavations and surveys have identified numerous sites along Roman roads that appear to have served this function. In some cases, these are marked by the remains of stable foundations, distinctive rectangular structures with divisions for individual animals. In other cases, they are identified by their location at the expected intervals along roads or by artifacts like horse gear, veterinary tools, or other equipment associated with animal care. Recent archaeological work in Gloucestershire in Britain uncovered an almost 2,000-year-old mutatio along what was likely part of Ermine Street, a major road connecting frontier zones. This site revealed two buildings, one for people and one for animals. In the animal quarter, archaeologists found bridles, harness fittings, and horse gear, confirming its function as a horse-changing station. The human quarters contained ovens, quernstones for grinding flour, and cooking areas, along with evidence of meals including bread, meat, and even snails, suggesting that while mutationes were primarily for changing horses, they also provided basic refreshment for travelers. The distinction between mansiones and mutationes was not always rigid. Some larger mutationes might offer basic overnight accommodation in emergencies, while some smaller mansiones on less traveled routes might have fewer amenities than the major lodging stations. The classification depended partly on official designation and partly on the practical scale of operations. Both types of stations served a common purpose, enabling continuous movement along the roads of the empire. Together, they created a chain of facilities that meant a courier or official traveling on the cursus publicus was never more than a few hours from rest, from fresh horses, from food and shelter. This predictability was essential. Knowing that stations existed at regular intervals allowed travelers to plan their journeys, to maintain steady paces, and to push forward even in difficult weather or challenging terrain because they knew that safety and assistance lay a predictable distance ahead. The existence of these stations transformed Roman roads from mere paths into true infrastructure for rapid communication. Without the mansiones and mutationes, the roads would have been impressive but ultimately limited in their utility for long-distance, time-sensitive travel. With these stations, the roads became arteries through which the lifeblood of imperial communication could flow, carrying messages, officials, and crucial goods across the vast expanse of Roman territory with unprecedented speed and reliability. Diplomata and the control of access. The cursus publicus was not open to all. It was a state system designed to serve the needs of government and military rather than private citizens. Access to the roads and stations was strictly controlled through a system of travel permits called diplomata, official documents that authorized their bearers to use the facilities and resources of the postal system. These diplomata were more than simple letters of authorization. They were carefully crafted documents issued by the emperor or by high-ranking officials acting with imperial authority that specified exactly what the bearer was entitled to use. A typical diploma might specify the name of the authorized traveler, the route they were permitted to take, the duration for which the authorization was valid, and the specific resources they could requisition: how many horses, how many mules, whether they could use wagons, and what accommodations they could claim at the stations. The physical form of a diploma varied over time and circumstance. Some were written on wooden tablets, the standard medium for many Roman documents. Others might be inscribed on bronze tablets, particularly for important or long-term authorizations. The document would bear the seal of the emperor or issuing official, a mark of wax or clay impressed with a signet ring that served as authentication. Without this seal, a diploma had no validity. The creation and issuance of diplomata was handled by specialized clerks within the imperial administration. In the 2nd century, there was an official called a diplomatibus, whose specific responsibility was drafting these travel permits. By the 3rd century, this function had been incorporated into the scrinium a memoria, one of the departments of the imperial secretariat. These clerks maintained records of all diplomata issued, creating an administrative paper trail that could be consulted if questions arose about authorization. The right to issue diplomata, called evectio, was itself strictly controlled. Initially, only the emperor could authorize the creation of these travel permits. This made sense in the earliest days of the cursus publicus, when the system was small and the number of authorized users was limited. But as the empire grew and the demands on the system increased, this centralized control became impractical. By the early 2nd century, provincial governors had been granted limited evectio rights. A governor could issue a specified number of diplomata per year, but only for official purposes and only to people genuinely engaged in state business. Each governor was personally responsible to the emperor for how they exercised this privilege. Trajan, in his correspondence with Pliny the Younger when Pliny served as governor of Bithynia, emphasized the need for careful control over the issuance of travel permits. Diplomata were not to be granted casually or as favors to friends and family. The restrictions on diplomata issuance reflected genuine concern about abuse of the system. Because using the cursus publicus was free for authorized travelers, whereas hiring private couriers or transport was expensive. There was obvious temptation to obtain diplomata under false pretenses for personal use. Provincial elites might pressure governors to grant them travel permits for private journeys. Officials might extend the use of their legitimately obtained diplomata beyond their authorized purposes. Such abuses, when they occurred, placed additional strain on the system. Every unauthorized traveler using the mansiones and mutationes consumed resources that had to be provided by local communities. Extra horses meant more feed to supply. Extra travelers meant more food to prepare and more facilities to maintain. If abuses became common, communities would be burdened far beyond what was necessary for legitimate state business. Emperors and administrators struggled continuously with this problem of abuse. Hadrian, emperor from 117 to 138, introduced reforms aimed at curbing excessive use of the postal system. He attempted to shift some of the costs of the cursus publicus from communities to the imperial treasury, hoping that if the state bore more of the financial burden, there would be greater incentive to prevent waste and misuse. Septimius Severus, who ruled from 193 to 211, made similar attempts at reform. He tried to establish clearer regulations about who could use the system and under what circumstances. He sought to make the cursus publicus more of a state-funded operation, rather than a burden imposed on local communities. However, these reforms were only partially successful. In practice, especially in more remote provinces, the old patterns persisted. Communities continued to bear most of the costs, and abuses continued to occur. Diocletian and Constantine, facing the crisis of the 3rd century and its aftermath, also attempted to strengthen control over the cursus publicus. They limited the number of officials who could issue diplomata, trying to reduce the opportunities for misuse. They imposed penalties for unauthorized use, including fines, dismissal from office, and in some cases relegatio, a form of exile. These measures had some effect, but could not eliminate the fundamental tension between the system's utility and its costs. The content of a diploma reveals the specificity with which the system was administered. The documents detailed not just who could travel, but how. A courier might be authorized to use the cursus seller, the fast post that employed mounted messengers and quick horse changes. An official might be authorized to use the cursus clabularis, which involved heavier vehicles suitable for transporting goods and equipment, but which moved more slowly. The diploma specified whether the holder could requisition horses, mules, wagons, or ox carts, each suitable for different types of travel. The permits also specified routes. A diploma might authorize travel from Rome to Alexandria by way of Brundisium and the sea route, or it might specify overland routes through particular provinces. This routing was not arbitrary. It ensured that travelers followed established postal routes where stations existed and where arrangements had been made for their support. It prevented people from wandering off established paths and demanding support in locations not equipped to provide it. Temporal limits were equally important. A diploma might be valid for 3 months, 6 months, or a year, depending on the nature of the travel being authorized. These time limits served multiple purposes. They ensured that permits could not be used indefinitely for repeated journeys when only one trip had been authorized. They created natural points at which the system could be reviewed and adjusted. And importantly, they became void upon the death of the emperor who had issued them or under whose authority they had been granted, a safeguard against permits being used during political transitions when new emperors might want to establish different policies. When a traveler arrived at a mansio or mutatio, station personnel would examine their diploma carefully. They would verify the seals, check that the travel was within the authorized route and time frame, and ensure that the resources being requested matched what the diploma permitted. Station masters kept records of who passed through and what resources they consumed, creating documentation that could be reviewed by provincial governors or imperial inspectors. This bureaucratic oversight, tedious as it may have been, served essential purposes. It created accountability. It provided a paper trail that could be audited. It made it more difficult for people to abuse the system without detection. The fact that abuses still occurred despite these controls suggests how attractive the system was for those who could gain access to it, and how persistent the pressures were from local elites and officials seeking to use imperial resources for private purposes. The diplomata system also reveals something about Roman administrative thinking. The Romans understood that creating infrastructure was not enough. They recognized that access to valuable resources had to be controlled, that rules needed enforcement, that officials required oversight. The elaborate system of permits, authorizations, inspections, and records reflected a sophisticated grasp of administrative challenges that many modern governments would recognize. For those who did receive legitimate diplomata, the permits opened access to a system of movement and communication that was unparalleled in the ancient world. With a valid diploma, a traveler could move from one end of the empire to the other with the confidence that they would find food, shelter, and fresh horses at predictable intervals. They could undertake journeys that would have been impossible or prohibitively expensive for private individuals. They became part of the machinery of imperial governance, their movements facilitated by a system designed to bind together an empire that stretched across continents. Personnel, the human engine of the cursus publicus. Behind the documents and facilities, behind the roads and stations, the cursus publicus depended ultimately on people. These individuals, from high-ranking administrators to humble, stable hands, formed the human machinery that kept the system operating. Understanding who these people were and what they did provides insight into how the cursus publicus actually functioned in practice. At the highest level stood the emperor himself, who retained ultimate authority over the postal system. The emperor decided who could issue diplomata, approved major changes to routes or policies, and adjudicated disputes about the system's operation. This was not merely ceremonial authority. Emperors took the cursus publicus seriously because they understood its importance to their ability to govern effectively. Below the emperor, the praetorian prefect held significant authority over the cursus publicus, particularly in later periods. The praetorian prefect, one of the most powerful officials in the empire, had responsibilities that included military command, judicial functions, and administrative oversight. Their involvement in the postal system reflected its importance to state operations. The prefect issued instructions to provincial governors about maintaining the cursus, regulated the issuance of diplomata, sent inspectors to review station operations, and exercised judicial authority over offenses related to the postal system. Provincial governors played crucial operational roles. Each governor was responsible for the portion of the cursus publicus that ran through their province. They coordinated with local authorities to ensure stations were maintained, supplies were provided, and personnel were available. They issued diplomata within their authorized limits and reported to the central government on the system's operation within their territories. This made them key intermediaries between the central imperial administration and the local communities that actually sustained the system. At the level of individual stations, the mansionarii, who managed the mansiones, and similar supervisors at the mutationes handled day-to-day operations. These station masters held positions of significant responsibility. They had to maintain facilities, manage supplies, supervise staff, and interact with the officials and couriers who passed through. The position offered opportunities for both legitimate income and corruption. A mansionarius might receive a modest salary from the imperial treasury or from provincial authorities, but they might also profit by diverting supplies, overcharging travelers for additional services beyond what their diplomata authorized, or accepting bribes to provide better accommodations or faster service. The actual couriers, the tabellarii who carried messages across the empire, came from various backgrounds. Many were slaves or freedmen owned by the imperial household or by high-ranking officials. Others were soldiers detached from military units for courier duty. Some were professional messengers who made their living by carrying dispatches. The emperor maintained a dedicated corps of imperial tabellarii, trusted individuals who carried the most sensitive and important messages. These imperial couriers were organized into companies, each supervised by an official called a praepositus tabellariorum. Different types of couriers served different functions. Tabellarii carried documents and letters. Cursores, literally runners, traveled on foot or horseback with urgent dispatches. Veridari, named after the fast horses called vereti that they rode, formed an elite class of mounted couriers used for the most time-sensitive communications. These veridari could travel with remarkable speed, changing horses frequently and pushing hard to deliver urgent messages. They represented the fastest communications technology available in the ancient world. The personnel at the stations included a variety of specialized workers. Veterinarians, the mulomedici, cared for the horses and mules that powered the system. These individuals needed real expertise in animal medicine, understanding how to treat common ailments, how to recognize when an animal was too sick or lame to work, how to keep herds healthy despite the stress of continuous use. Their work was essential because the entire system depended on maintaining a ready supply of healthy animals. Wheelwrights, the carpentarii, repaired and maintained the vehicles used on the cursus publicus. Wagons and carts subjected to continuous use over rough roads required constant maintenance. Wheels needed to be repaired or replaced. Axles broke and had to be fixed. Fittings wore out and needed attention. The carpentarii provided these services, ensuring that vehicles remained roadworthy. Grooms, the hippocomi, cared for horses on a daily basis. They fed and watered the animals, cleaned stables, exercised horses that were resting, groomed animals to keep them healthy, and prepared fresh mounts for travelers who needed them. This was hard physical labor, requiring long hours and constant attention to the needs of the animals. In the stables and at the stations, there were muleteers, the millenniums, who drove the wagons and carts when officials traveled with their baggage and equipment. These drivers needed skill in handling teams of animals, knowledge of the roads, and the physical endurance to spend long days on the road. All of these specialized workers needed to be recruited, trained, and compensated. The recruitment often fell to local communities, who were required to provide the necessary personnel as part of their obligations to support the cursus publicus. Communities would assign these duties to individuals, often through systems of compulsory service that rotated the burden among residents or that assigned tasks based on social status and wealth. Compensation varied. Some station personnel received modest wages from imperial funds or from provincial treasuries. Others worked essentially as corvée labor, required service that communities had to provide without direct payment. Still others worked as private contractors called mancipes, who bid for the right to operate stations in exchange for fees or the ability to profit from providing services beyond those mandated by diplomata. The inspector system provided oversight. Officials called curiosi, sent out by the magister officiorum or by the praetorian prefect, traveled along postal routes examining station operations. These inspectors checked that facilities were properly maintained, that authorized travelers received appropriate service, that unauthorized persons were denied access, and that station masters were not engaging in corruption or abuse. The inspection system provided a means for the central government to monitor a far-flung network and to identify problems before they became critical. Despite these oversight mechanisms, abuses occurred regularly. Station masters might demand unofficial payments from travelers, claiming that supplies were short or that better service required extra fees. They might divert supplies meant for the cursus publicus to private sale. They might provide poor service to travelers they disliked or preferential service to those who bribed them. Provincial officials might pressure station masters to provide services to their clients and supporters, even without proper authorization. The emperors and their administrators issued periodic edicts attempting to curb these abuses. Constantine issued regulations about animal welfare, forbidding the overuse of horses in ways that would damage them. Julian limited the number of diplomata that provincial governors could issue, trying to reduce the overall burden on the system. Valentinian and Theodosius imposed stricter penalties for unauthorized use and abuse of the system. These measures had some effect, but could never entirely eliminate the problems inherent in any large bureaucratic system where valuable resources were controlled by officials who had opportunities for personal gain. The personnel of the cursus publicus taken together represented a significant human infrastructure. Thousands of individuals across the empire dedicated their labor to making the system function. Station masters and their staffs, veterinarians and wheelwrights, grooms and muleteers, couriers and inspectors all played their parts in maintaining the flow of communication and movement that bound the empire together. Their labor was not always appreciated. They worked in what was often a thankless occupation, maintaining facilities in remote locations, caring for animals in all weather, serving travelers who might be demanding or rude, and receiving compensation that was often inadequate for the work required. Yet their collective efforts made possible the administrative cohesion that allowed Rome to govern its vast territories with reasonable effectiveness for centuries. Private mail and the tabularia privati. While the cursus publicus served the needs of the state, private citizens and businesses also needed to send correspondence across the empire. Merchants needed to communicate with trading partners. Families wanted to exchange letters with distant relatives. Scholars corresponded with colleagues in other cities. These private communication needs were met not by the state postal system but by alternative arrangements. During the Republican period and continuing into the imperial era, wealthy Romans maintained personal courier services using their household slaves. A senator might own dozens or even hundreds of slaves, and among these would be individuals designated as tabularii, letter carriers. These private tabularii carried correspondence for their masters, often traveling along the same roads used by the cursus publicus, and sometimes even obtaining permission to use the mansiones and mutationes through connections or bribery. The correspondence of Cicero, the famous orator and politician of the late Republic, provides extensive evidence of this private courier system. Cicero maintained regular correspondence with friends, family, and political associates across the Mediterranean world. His letters mention the slaves who carried his messages, the challenges of finding reliable couriers, and the delays that could occur when messengers were detained or when weather prevented travel. Friends might share courier services to reduce costs. Cicero's letters occasionally mention sending correspondence through friends' slaves who happened to be traveling in the right direction. During the Republic, the official state couriers and those employed by the publicani, the tax collectors, would sometimes carry private letters for important hen as a courtesy or in exchange for favors. This informal system worked adequately when connections existed, but it meant that those without wealth or influential friends had limited ability to send long-distance correspondence. Under the empire, as the cursus publicus became more restricted to official use, private courier services professionalized. Organizations of tabularii privatae emerged, essentially commercial courier companies that would carry letters in small packages for paying customers. These services operated along the same major routes as the state system, following the good Roman roads and often stopping at private inns and taverns that served as way stations for commercial travelers. The cost of sending a letter through these private services varied based on distance and weight. Sending correspondence across the Mediterranean was not cheap, which meant that a long-distance letter writing remained primarily an activity of the wealthy and the commercial classes. Ordinary people might send letters when traveling merchants or soldiers offered to carry them, but regular correspondence over great distances was beyond the means of most. Private couriers faced hazards that their official counterparts also encountered, but without the protections that came from imperial authority. Bandits targeted couriers, knowing they might carry valuables or information worth stealing. Bad weather could delay journeys or make roads impassable. Accidents, illness, and the simple difficulties of ancient travel all posed risks. A letter sent from Rome to Alexandria might take weeks to arrive under good conditions, months if circumstances were unfavorable, and might not arrive at all if the courier met with misfortune. The materials used for private correspondence tell us something about Roman communication practices. Letters were commonly written on thin wooden tablets coated with wax. The sender would use a stylus, a pointed instrument usually made of bronze or bone, to scratch the message into the wax. One end of the stylus was sharp for writing. The other end was flat for smoothing the wax when corrections were needed. These wax tablets could be bound together for longer messages, creating a sort of primitive book. For more permanent correspondence, Romans used papyrus, sheets made from the pith of papyrus plants grown primarily in Egypt. Papyrus was relatively expensive, so its use was reserved for important letters or documents meant to be preserved. The writing was done with reed pens and ink made from soot mixed with gum and water. Papyrus sheets could be rolled into scrolls for transport. Letters were sealed with wax to ensure privacy and to verify that they had not been opened and read during transit. The sender would drip hot wax onto the closure point of the letter and then press their signet ring into the wax, creating a distinctive seal that would break if anyone tried to open the letter. This provided some security, though a determined person could carefully melt and reseal wax to conceal tampering. The address would be written on the outside of the letter, and it typically followed a standard formula. The sender's name appeared first, in the nominative case. Then came the recipient's name in the dative case. A standard greeting followed, often abbreviated. The letter might begin with a health wish, a formulaic expression hoping for the recipient's well-being. The existence of this parallel private system alongside the state cursus publicus reveals the stratified nature of Roman communication. The state had its efficient, organized system for official needs. The wealthy had their reliable private couriers. Those with moderate means could pay commercial courier services, but for the poor majority of the empire's population, long-distance communication remained difficult and irregular, dependent on chance opportunities and the kindness of travelers willing to carry messages. The division between state and private communication also had political implications. The cursus publicus carried official decrees, military dispatches, administrative correspondence, and intelligence reports. Private systems carried personal letters, commercial information, and unofficial news. The state's monopoly on the fastest and most reliable communication system gave it an informational advantage, allowing emperors and governors to coordinate their actions more effectively than potential opponents could coordinate resistance or rebellion. Yet the existence of private communication channels also meant that information could flow outside official channels. News of events might spread through commercial networks or through the letters of private individuals before official reports reached Rome. Scholars could exchange ideas. Merchants could share market information. Christians, in the early centuries when their religion was sometimes persecuted, could maintain networks of communication through private letters and trusted messengers, spreading their faith even as the official state apparatus sometimes worked against them. The economic burden and social cost. The cursus publicus, for all its administrative brilliance and utility to the state, imposed significant burdens on the communities and individuals who sustained it. Understanding these costs provides important perspective on how the system actually functioned and how it was perceived by those who lived under Roman rule. The financial obligations fell primarily on provincial populations rather than on the central imperial treasury. This arrangement had historical roots in Roman fiscal policy. During the Republic, revenues from conquered provinces had been so substantial that direct taxation of Roman citizens in Italy had been abolished. The empire was to be supported by the provinces, and the cursus publicus was one of many costs that provincial communities bore. Communities along postal routes were required to provide the physical infrastructure, building the mansiones and mutationes, maintaining these facilities, and repairing them when they fell into disrepair. Construction costs could be enormous. A substantial mansio required skilled labor, quality materials, and considerable time to build. Even simple mutationes needed stables, storage facilities, and basic shelters, all of which cost money and labor to construct. Ongoing maintenance was a continuous expense. Buildings required repairs as they aged, roofs leaked and needed replacement, floors wore down under constant traffic, stables had to be cleaned and maintained to keep animals healthy. All of this work had to be organized and paid for by local communities. The supply of animals represented another major cost. Communities were required to maintain specified numbers of horses, mules, and other animals for use by the cursus publicus. A typical station might need to keep 30 to 40 animals ready for use. These animals had to be purchased, which alone represented significant capital investment. A good horse was valuable, worth perhaps several months' wages for an ordinary laborer. Feeding these animals required enormous quantities of fodder. A single horse might consume 20 pounds of hay and 10 pounds of grain per day. Multiply this by 30 or 40 animals, then by 365 days per year, and the total quantity of feed needed becomes staggering. This fodder had to be grown, harvested, stored, and transported to the stations. In regions where agriculture was marginal or where harvests failed, obtaining sufficient feed could be extremely difficult. Veterinary care added to the costs. Animals needed regular attention to remain healthy. They required shoeing every few weeks as their hooves wore down on paved roads. They needed treatment when they fell sick or were injured. Replacing animals that died or became too old or lame to work required continuous expenditure. Personnel costs were substantial. Station masters, stable hands, grooms, veterinarians, wheelwrights, cooks, and all the other workers needed to operate the system required compensation. While some of this labor might be provided through corvée obligations, skilled workers like veterinarians typically demanded payment. Even corvée labor imposed costs on communities, as workers diverted to postal service were not available for other economic activities. The burden of these costs was distributed among property owners in communities along postal routes. The exact mechanisms varied by region and period, but generally speaking, wealthier landowners bore proportionally greater shares of the costs. Local decurions, the town councilors who belonged to the curial class, were often held personally responsible for ensuring that their communities met their obligations to the cursus publicus. This system of distributing costs created significant resentment. From the perspective of a provincial landowner, the cursus publicus primarily served the interests of distant imperial authorities. The messages and officials moving along the roads were conducting state business that might have little relevance to local concerns. Yet local populations had to pay for the system's operation through their taxes and compulsory service obligations. The burden was particularly heavy for communities on major routes that saw heavy traffic. A town situated on the road from Rome to a major provincial capital might see dozens or even hundreds of official travelers passing through each month. Each required fresh horses, food, and accommodation. The cumulative cost could be crushing, especially for smaller or poorer communities that had limited economic resources. Abuses of the system intensified these burdens. When officials used their diplomata for unauthorized purposes, when they traveled with larger entourages than their permits allowed, when they demanded better accommodations or more resources than they were entitled to, the costs multiplied. Local station masters and communities had limited ability to refuse such demands, especially when they came from powerful officials who could cause trouble for anyone who denied them. The emperors recognized these problems and periodically attempted reforms. Hadrian tried to shift more costs to the imperial treasury. Septimius Severus attempted to regulate the system more strictly and to compensate communities for their expenses. But these reforms faced a fundamental obstacle. The imperial treasury itself relied on provincial taxation for most of its revenue. Compensating provinces for supporting the cursus publicus meant taking money from provinces through taxes and then returning some portion of it for postal expenses, an administrative complexity that often proved unworkable in practice. Diocletian's administrative reforms in the late 3rd century attempted to address the financial crisis afflicting the empire by reorganizing taxation and provincial administration. His efforts included attempts to rationalize the funding of the cursus publicus. Constantine continued these reform efforts. But the fundamental problem remained. The system was expensive to operate, and the costs ultimately fell on provincial populations who received little direct benefit from it. By the 4th and 5th centuries, as the empire faced increasing military pressures, economic difficulties, and administrative challenges, the burden of the cursus publicus on provincial communities had become severe. Complaints about the costs appear in legal codes and in the writings of contemporary authors. Some communities fell into economic hardship, partly because of the expenses they were required to bear. The system that had once helped bind the empire together was becoming a source of strain that contributed to the empire's fragmentation. The social costs extended beyond the purely financial. The corvée labor required for the cursus publicus took people away from productive work on farms and in workshops. The constant passage of official travelers disrupted local life as communities had to accommodate the demands of strangers who wielded imperial authority. The hierarchical nature of the system, where those with diplomata could command resources and service, reinforced social inequalities and demonstrated daily the subordinate position of provincial populations within the imperial structure. Yet for all these costs and complaints, communities generally complied with their obligations. Open resistance to the cursus publicus would have constituted resistance to imperial authority itself, an extremely dangerous position to take. Provincial governors had the power to punish communities that failed to meet their obligations. The emperor's displeasure, however distant it might seem, carried real threats. Most communities accepted the burdens as part of the price of being within the Roman Empire, alongside taxation, military recruitment, and other impositions that came with Roman rule. The cursus publicus thus reveals a tension at the heart of the Roman imperial system. The empire required effective communication to function. Effective communication required infrastructure and resources. But the extraction of those resources from provincial populations created resentment and economic strain that ultimately weakened the very structure the system was meant to support. This dynamic, repeated across many aspects of Roman administration, contributed to the empire's eventual transformation and decline. Decline, transformation, and Byzantine continuation. The history of the cursus publicus does not end with a sudden collapse, but rather with a gradual transformation that paralleled the broader changes affecting the Roman Empire during its later centuries. Understanding this decline requires attention to the multiple pressures that accumulated over the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. The 3rd century brought what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of political instability, military pressure, and economic disruption that severely tested the empire's institutions. Between 235 and 284, the empire saw dozens of claimants to imperial authority, many of whom ruled only briefly before being overthrown or killed. This political chaos disrupted administration across the empire, including the operation of the cursus publicus. During periods of civil war, when multiple claimants to the throne controlled different regions, the unified postal system fragmented. Each would-be emperor needed communication networks to control their territories, but coordination across the empire broke down. Roads fell into disrepair when no stable authority took responsibility for maintenance. Stations were damaged or destroyed in fighting. The supply chains that provided fodder and other necessities were disrupted. Economic difficulties compounded these political problems. The 3rd century saw significant inflation as emperors debased the currency to pay their armies. Tax revenues declined as trade contracted and agricultural production fell in some regions. Communities that were already struggling to meet the costs of the cursus publicus found these burdens increasingly unsupportable when their economic circumstances worsened. External pressures intensified during this period. Germanic peoples pressed against the Rhine and Danube frontiers with increasing frequency and force. The Sassanid Persian Empire, which had replaced the Parthians in the east, proved a formidable adversary that required substantial Roman military resources to contain. These military challenges meant that resources that might have gone to maintaining infrastructure were instead diverted to defense. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries temporarily stabilized the empire and brought some recovery to the cursus publicus. Diocletian reorganized provincial administration, creating smaller provinces under more direct imperial control. He attempted to control inflation through price edicts. He strengthened the military through increases in troop numbers and improvements in organization. These measures provided the stability needed for the postal system to function more reliably. Constantine's establishment of Constantinople as a new imperial capital in 330 created a second major node for the cursus publicus. Roads and stations had to be organized to connect this new center of power with the rest of the empire. The system adapted, demonstrating its resilience and continued importance to imperial administration. But the underlying problems persisted. The division of the empire into eastern and western halves, formalized in the late 4th century, meant that the unified postal system increasingly operated as two separate networks, one serving the Western Emperor and one serving the Eastern. Coordination between these halves became more difficult. The 5th century brought catastrophic challenges for the Western Empire. Peoples from beyond the frontiers, driven by their own pressures and seeking land and security, moved into imperial territories in increasing numbers. The Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, a shocking event that demonstrated the vulnerability of even the empire's heart. Over subsequent decades, Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, and other groups established kingdoms within what had been Roman territory. As central authority weakened in the west, the cursus publicus deteriorated. Roads that were not maintained developed potholes and washouts. Bridges collapsed and were not rebuilt. Stations fell into ruin when communities no longer had the resources or the compulsion to maintain them. The network fragmented into local systems controlled by whatever authorities held power in particular regions. The formal end of the Western Empire in 476, when the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, did not immediately terminate the cursus publicus, but it marked the end of any unified system. The successor kingdoms that emerged in the West maintained some elements of Roman postal infrastructure where it served their interests. The Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who ruled Italy in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, preserved parts of the cursus publicus within his realm, recognizing its utility for administration. But without the extensive territories and administrative apparatus of the empire, these successor states could not maintain the scope and reliability that had characterized the Roman system. The network shrank. Stations that were no longer economically viable closed. Roads that connected territories no longer under common rule lost their importance. The once vast web of communication that had bound together the Mediterranean world contracted into local and regional networks. In the Eastern Empire, which would come to be called the Byzantine Empire, the story was different. The eastern provinces were wealthier than the western. They faced external threats, but weathered them more successfully. Byzantine emperors maintained effective administration and continued to recognize the importance of rapid communication for governance and military coordination. The Byzantine cursus publicus evolved but persisted. The system that had been called cursus publicus in the West continued under various names in the East. Administrative reforms adapted it to Byzantine needs. The network focused on connecting Constantinople with key provincial centers in Asia Minor, the Balkans, and later territories. The scale was smaller than the empire-wide network of earlier centuries, but the principle remained. The state needed organized, reliable means of communication. The Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565, has been credited with both maintaining and partially dismantling the cursus publicus. Sources suggest he reduced the system's extent, perhaps as a cost-saving measure, maintaining service only on the most critical routes, particularly those leading to the Persian frontier, where Byzantine military forces faced their greatest threat. This represented a rational adjustment to reduced resources and changed strategic circumstances, but it also marked the system's contraction from its former scope. Byzantine administration continued to use organized courier systems through the medieval period. The fundamental need that the cursus publicus had addressed, the need for rulers to communicate rapidly with distant territories, persisted as long as centralized states with extensive territories existed. The Byzantine system evolved over centuries, adapting to changing technologies, threats, and administrative structures, but maintained core elements of organized stations, authorized messengers, and state-controlled infrastructure. The influence of the Roman postal system extended beyond the territories that Rome had directly controlled. Islamic caliphates that emerged in the 7th and 8th centuries developed their own postal systems, called barid, that drew on both Persian and Roman precedents. Medieval European kingdoms, as they consolidated power, created courier networks for royal business. The Holy Roman Empire maintained postal services that consciously looked back to Roman examples. The idea that a state should maintain infrastructure for rapid communication, that there should be organized stations at regular intervals, that authorization systems should control access to state resources, that roads should connect territories under common administration. All of these concepts that the cursus publicus embodied influenced how later states thought about communication and control. Even the modern postal services that emerged in Europe during the early modern period owed something to the Roman example. When royal post offices developed in France, Britain, and other European states, their organizers knew of the Roman cursus publicus from classical texts. They understood that Rome had solved certain logistical problems and had created systems that functioned across vast distances. While modern postal systems differed in many specifics, the basic idea that communication could be organized, regularized, and made reliable through state action and infrastructure came down in part from Roman precedent. Legacy and the long view. As we reach the end of our journey through the Roman postal system, it is worth reflecting on what the cursus publicus reveals about the Roman Empire itself and about the challenges of governing large territories in any era. The cursus publicus demonstrated Roman administrative capacity at its finest. The system required coordination across enormous distances, the movement of substantial resources, the cooperation of thousands of individuals, and sustained attention over centuries. That the Romans accomplished this, that they created and maintained such a system for hundreds of years, speaks to organizational abilities that few ancient states could match. The postal system also revealed Roman priorities. Communication was important enough to justify substantial costs. Control over information and movement was seen as essential to imperial authority. The state devoted significant resources to ensuring that emperors and governors could know what occurred in distant regions and could coordinate responses to crises and opportunities. This investment in communication infrastructure paralleled investments in military infrastructure, in urban amenities, and in other systems that supported imperial power. Yet the cursus publicus also exposed tensions and limitations in the Roman system. The burden placed on provincial communities created resentment. The potential for abuse created opportunities for corruption. The costs of maintaining the system grew as the empire faced increasing challenges. What had been a source of strength became, in the later empire, another strain on overstretched resources and increasingly resentful populations. The physical remains of the cursus publicus, the archaeological traces of stations along ancient roads, the milestones that still mark distances 2,000 years after they were placed, these remnants remind us of the scale and durability of Roman engineering. The roads that the postal system used continue to influence travel patterns today. Many modern highways follow routes that the Romans established. Cities grew at Roman postal stations and continue to exist as modern towns. The documentary evidence, the diplomata fragments, the legal codes that regulated the system, the letters that mention couriers and travel, these sources reveal the human dimension of ancient communication. They show us people trying to maintain contact across distances, trying to govern distant territories, trying to coordinate complex activities in an era when information moved slowly and uncertainly. For those of us living in an age of instant global communication, when messages circle the globe at the speed of light, when we can speak with someone on another continent in real time, the cursus publicus seems primitive. A system that could move a message across the empire in weeks seems impossibly slow when we expect responses to our emails and messages within minutes or hours. Yet understanding the cursus publicus provides perspective on our own systems. The Romans faced the fundamental challenge of communication across distance and solved it as well as their technology and resources allowed. They created infrastructure, they established procedures, they trained personnel, they regulated access. They maintained the system for centuries. These are the same challenges in principle that modern communication systems face, even if our solutions differ vastly in their technological sophistication. The cursus publicus also reminds us that communication systems are always about power and control as much as they are about connection. The Roman postal system served the state. It enabled emperors to govern. It supported military operations. It facilitated tax collection. It was a tool of imperial administration. The benefits it provided to private citizens were incidental to its primary purpose of maintaining imperial authority. This political dimension of communication infrastructure remains relevant. Whether we consider modern postal services, telecommunications networks, or digital communication systems, questions of access, control, regulation, and purpose persist. Who can use these systems? Who controls them? Who benefits from them? Who bears the costs? These questions that the Romans grappled with in organizing the cursus publicus remain with us in different forms. The decline of the cursus publicus, along with the broader transformation of the Roman Empire, also offers lessons. Complex systems require sustained support to function. When the economic, political, and military foundations that supported the cursus publicus eroded, the system could not maintain itself. Infrastructure requires maintenance. Organizations need resources. Communication networks depend on stability. When these conditions fail, even well-designed systems deteriorate. Yet the persistence of some elements of the cursus publicus, its continuation in modified form in the Byzantine Empire, its influence on later postal systems, demonstrates that good ideas and effective solutions can outlive the specific circumstances that produced them. The Romans created something useful, and aspects of their creation persisted and influenced later developments long after the empire that built it had transformed into something very different. As we imagine the couriers riding along Roman roads, stopping at stations to change horses, carrying sealed dispatches from Rome to distant provinces, we can appreciate both the sophistication of what the Romans achieved and the limitations they faced. They built something remarkable with the tools and knowledge available to them. They sustained it for centuries. They adapted it to changing circumstances. And when circumstances changed so dramatically that the system could no longer function in its original form, elements of it survived and influenced what came after. The cursus publicus stands as a monument to Roman administrative thinking, to their engineering capabilities, to their understanding that empires require communication to function effectively. It reveals both the power and the limits of organization, both the possibilities and the costs of attempting to govern vast territories and diverse populations under unified authority. In the quiet traces of ancient roads, in the foundations of stations excavated by archaeologists, in the words of documents that authorized travel 2 millennia ago, we can still perceive the outlines of this extraordinary system. We can understand how the Romans solved the problem of distance and time, how they bound together an empire that stretched from ocean to ocean, from northern forests to southern deserts, creating for a time a unified system of communication across much of the known world. And perhaps in understanding what they built and how it worked, in appreciating both its achievements and its limitations, we can gain perspective on our own communication systems, our own administrative challenges, and our own attempts to coordinate activity and maintain connection across distances that, while they may seem trivial by comparison to what the Romans faced, still require thoughtful organization, sustained effort, and attention to both the practical details of implementation and the broader questions of purpose and benefit. The story of the cursus publicus is ultimately a human story. It is about people trying to solve problems, to maintain connections, to govern effectively, to move information across space in an era when doing so required enormous effort. It is a story of engineers building roads that would last for millennia, of administrators creating procedures that would regulate a vast system, of couriers riding through all weather to deliver their messages, of station masters maintaining facilities in remote locations, of communities bearing burdens to support a system that primarily served distant authorities. It is a story of success and limitation, of achievement and cost, of persistence and eventual transformation. It is, in the end, a story that reveals something essential about the Roman Empire and about the eternal human challenge of communication across distance and time. The roads still remain. The stones still mark distances. And in the modern world, as we send our messages across networks that would have seemed like magic to the Romans, we can remember that the fundamental challenge, connecting people separated by space, solving the problem of distance, remains constant even as our solutions evolve. If you have found this journey through the cursus publicus interesting, if you have enjoyed learning about how the Romans organized their postal system and bound their empire together through roads and stations and couriers, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more historical documentaries that explore the practical details of ancient life and administration.